On WNIN Lawmakers this week, we're joined by two local political science professors to discuss what we can expect from our lawmakers this year at the local, state, and federal levels. That's coming up next on WNIN Lawmakers. Welcome to WNIN Lawmakers. I'm John Gibson, news manager and local host of WNIN FM's Morning Edition. Before we check in with our guests, here are two reports from Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith. One on Governor Holcomb's budget priorities, and then an update on what happened in the General Assembly this past week.
Holcomb's proposals include an increase of more than $1 billion for K-12 education. He wants to spend $500 million on his READY program, an economic development initiative he launched 2 years ago. And he wants to boost public health funding by more than $300 million. The next step, getting lawmakers to go along with all of that.
I think Indiana has done one of the better jobs, quite frankly, in the country in addressing not just inflation, but a potential recession by our fiscal stewardship, making sure that we're living within our means.
While Holcomb's budget proposal represents a major increase in spending over the last state budget, it appears that it doesn't quite keep up with increases in inflation over the last 2 years. Indiana's Constitution only allows judges to deny bail for people charged with murder or treason. A proposed constitutional amendment that cleared a Senate committee this week would allow judges to deny bail for any crime if the person is a substantial risk to the public. Proponents say it's about public safety. Opponents worry it will worsen existing racial disparities in the justice system. A Senate panel discussed legislation to expand a voucher program to cover any private school student in the state. The Education Savings Account program was created last year for students with disabilities. This year's proposed bill would cap the program at $10 million, but remove any eligibility guidelines. And a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of Indiana's near-total abortion ban got a hearing before the state Supreme Court. The justices pushed back against arguments from both abortion care providers and the state. There's no timetable for a ruling. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
We're joined now by Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Evansville, Dr. Robert Dion, and Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Southern Indiana, Dr. Matthew Hanke. I'd like to thank you both for being here today. We appreciate you coming in. Let's start at the state level here. Governor Holcomb, obviously a Republican, and we have a Republican-dominated legislature, but yet there might be some friction there. Well, let's start with Dr. Dion. Do you think the governor will get some pushback from Republicans in the General Assembly for some of his budgetary plans?
It's possible. I mean, he talked about fiscal stewardship, and you want to be careful not to spend too much too fast, and so there's going to be some people in there who want to maybe throttle back a bit. But as you suggested, they're in the enviable position of having a big surplus, billions of dollars, and an enormous supermajority, which means if they can come together as a party, they'll get what they want. Right. There have been some frictions here and there between the governor and members of his party, but I think it's mostly on the fringes to be obvious about that. The legislative leaders, the speaker and the head of the state senate, I think are mostly in tune with what the governor wants. I think there's some noisy people on the fringe who might want to kick up a fuss, but the size of the majority really kind of allows the adults in the room to stay focused on the serious matters.
Professor Hanke, is that your feeling as well?
There will be some differences. We're showing that Governor Holcomb is proposing increases in salaries for Indiana State troopers. He wants to eliminate textbook fees. He's not really that keen on some of the proposals that the House Republicans are pushing towards totally eliminating at some point, phasing out the income tax.
Right.
He's concerned about how are you going to fill that huge gap of about $8 billion a year in revenue from the income tax alone. So you are going to see graduated sort of decreases. So I think on some of those things they can come up with some differences. But but the big picture, a lot of the priorities seem to be in sync with the legislative leaders.
Yes, indeed. Now, Dr. Dion mentioned the big surplus, the budget surpluses that Indiana has had for several years now. Do we think, is that going to change? I mean, should the state reevaluate its budget strategy if there's constantly such a large surplus? Dr. Henke, what do you think of that?
I think there's a lot of pressing needs for Indiana, and one that probably will see some attention is dealing with housing affordability and availability. That they are linking this important issue to economic development and workforce development. And so if there's funds available, the legislature should not be shy of trying to use some of those surplus funds and not always push as almost a virtue of having way too much in the coffers. That there are going to be some needs that the legislature in subsequent sessions can't keep kicking down the road. Right. Because if Indiana is going to be a place that you're going to attract, if workforce development is that top priority that Governor Holcomb always says, there's a lot of missing pieces in that can be filled with substantive legislation and substantive funding on some important issues.
Yes. Now, Dr. Dion, I know some legislative leaders say we like that big surplus. It needs to be there for a rainy day or for something totally unexpected. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think the surpluses have been too big, and do you think there's any chance that there'll be some movement on that?
Well, if it were up to me, I think they're too big. But gosh knows, everybody, we just lived through a surprise situation with COVID and the pandemic. So you never know what's around. We've had all sorts of shocks to the economy. And so there's a strong argument to be made that we want to have some money set aside.
Sure.
But at a certain point, Dr. Henke is right. You don't want to crow about sitting on a big pile of money when there are urgent needs in the state. And I think there are a lot of thoughtful people in both parties, in both chambers, who would like to make a mark and drive up workforce development or rethink public health or rethink education. And it sure seems like Governor Holcomb wants to go out on that note. It kind of reminds me of the last time we had a governor from Evansville, Bob Orr, and he focused very heavily on education. It's such a powerful investment. You don't want to brag too much about having a ton of money in the bank when education is suffering.
Right.
We'd much rather go the other way.
And the governor has talked about lifting teacher wages considerably, right?
Yeah, and textbook fees being eliminated, phased out, sure.
Right. Federal stimulus money, you mentioned the COVID pandemic. Of course, a lot of federal stimulus money came, with all of that problem. How is that affecting things? And I guess it's going away soon, correct?
Yeah, I'm afraid we're all on a sugar high from this. We've been awash in money. It just flew out of Congress, and rightfully so, I think, because we were in big trouble. But there weren't a lot of clear plans on how to use it. The city, the county are still trying to figure out how to spend that glut of money that has trickled down to them. And soon enough, that money's going to go away. So everybody needs to understand that that's a one shot. It's not going to be an ongoing source of revenue.
And I'll add that that money has to be spent by the end of 2026. And I believe, if I understand it, $62 or $64 million that Evansville received from a number of priorities, looking at housing, looking at other kinds of critical needs. And yeah, it's a one-term thing. And from my understanding from conversations I have with people around town, there's not been that much guidance from the Treasury Department on how local governments can use this. So I think the city's waiting for some of that, but there is a timeline to spend that.
Right.
But it'll be very beneficial for Evansville.
Yeah, there is a deadline there, as you mentioned. As we learned this past week, the Indiana Supreme Court heard arguments regarding the abortion ban injunction this week. How soon do you think we might get a ruling, and any indication on what that ruling might be? We'll start with Professor Henke.
I'm not sure when we'll see a specific time of when this ruling will be, but it'll be significant in terms of whether or not the decision over the summer was upheld.
There's two cases. There's one that took place at the Supreme Court. There's another taking place this week in Monroe County. During the Supreme Court argument, one of the justices said to the Solicitor General, "Why don't you have a statewide referendum to settle this question?" And I'm inclined to think that if they did that in Indiana, I know the Republican Party has done polling on this, they would lose, just as they lost in Kentucky and Kansas and across the country. So the Republican Party kind of got ahead of itself and ahead of public opinion. and now they're dealing with the aftermath of that. There's no way of knowing when the Supreme Court's going to rule,
Right.
but I do know that the legislature is likely to be frozen in place at this point. There's no sensible argument for them to jump in and raise a ruckus about this until the Supreme Court has spoken.
Right.
That way, maybe if the thing gets overturned or something, then they can have a legislative response, but they're going to be quiet, I think.
And I would say that they probably are looking at Kentucky and the responses to the amendment that was in November as sort of guidance on how to come across. But also, I'm not sure if when it comes to social issues, you're going to see a lot of legislation, like the abortion issue or some other things that are going to gain traction. That'll be something where it's a wait and see on that decision.
And remind us about the Kentucky amendment. What happened in the Commonwealth?
So it was an amendment that was going to be put into the Constitution that would essentially outlaw abortion, and that amendment failed to eliminate it, 53-47, which was very interesting because there was a disconnect between that and the strong Republican showing that you saw among those that were elected. So, for instance, Rand Paul was reelected to the Senate with 61% of the vote. Yet those same voters voted 40. They only were able to carry 47%. So there was this gap between doing away with it. So Dr. Dion's right that there is this tendency with Indiana, Kentucky to or at least some of those advocates, to get ahead too much of the issue, or to be too eager to kind of push something.
And to get a constitutional amendment approved, that requires several votes, correct?
Two successive sessions.
Yeah, it's a lengthy and difficult process. The Constitution is not easy to change, I guess, is the course there. Well, let's move on to the federal government now. We've heard a lot about things happening on Capitol Hill. How do you think the new Congress will function with a small Republican majority in the House, a small Democratic majority in the Senate, and of course the White House still controlled by Democrats? Let's start with Dr. Dion. What are some of your feelings as this new Congress gets underway?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the Indiana General Assembly will be more productive than the U.S. Congress.
Yes.
I think divided government returning to Washington is going to be hit the brakes on any sort of legislative productivity. The Senate can't get what it wants with the new Republican majority in the House, and Speaker McCarthy and his tiny majority of 5 is not going to be able to pass Republican legislation through Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden. So you're going to see a lot of executive actions where the president does those things that are within his power because the legislature is not going to help. And you're going to see Speaker McCarthy and the Republicans turn their attention from legislation, which is a dead end for them, to investigations, just relentless investigations of Mayorkas and Fauci and Biden and Hunter Biden. And I'm not sure that's going to wear well with the voters. I'm not sure that there's a lot of polling evidence that suggests that that's not what people voted for.
Right. And Professor Hanke, do you agree with that we'll be looking at quite a bit of a stalemate in terms of legislation?
I agree with that. I think Dr. Dion's right in the sense that in the end game, however the House Republicans are trying to pursue their agenda in the session, is going to fall flat because it's going to wear on the voters. In many ways, what they've seen in the last couple of weeks with the 15 votes for Speaker of the House, with a lot of the factions challenging the very existence of the institution, that's going to begin, and they're not going to stop doing that. They're going to continue to be tensions, as a lot of the viewers probably maybe have heard that there is a part of the rules package that was agreed upon that was a condition for people supporting Speaker McCarthy was to allow a motion to overturn or motion to remove the speaker just with one member of Congress, and so that's going to be very chaotic. So if something doesn't go exactly the way of some of these fringe parts of the party or the caucus, you're going to see a disruption of the House, and you're going to see a lot of disruptions as we go through this 118th Congress.
With such a small majority for the Republicans in the House, any chance that Democrats could sway a handful of Republicans to do something they'd like to do?
I think the clearest opportunity in the near term is going to be something like the debt ceiling. I don't know who it's going to be, but all they need is 5 moderate Republicans who don't want to blow up the economy, and you could get all the Democrats to hang together. You know, Nancy Pelosi, when she was Speaker, had the world's thinnest majority. She had the same size majority that McCarthy has now. But she was able to keep her caucus running smoothly, even though there are lots of Democrats who don't like each other. I don't know what on earth McCarthy's going to do. He's on thin ice. But if the debt ceiling question gets really dangerous in June, say, or July, I think there's going to be an active effort to find some Republicans to join hands with the Democrats, just like they did under Speaker Boehner,
Right.
to sort of be the adult and not blow up the economy.
Dr. Henke, you think there is some possibility of that?
There's going to have to be. I think there is. If the House and any of these fringe Republicans are going to make movements, or certainly pound the table to say, okay, we want these concessions, we want a lot of cuts, they're going to be looking to the Senate, or at least the Senate's going to put pressure, because the Senate is going to handle this. Mitch McConnell, as the Republican leader, is not going to let the debt ceiling. He has said this as this isn't something that you toy with this. I don't think that message is going to be clear for those in the House side. They're going to push their caucus, whatever fringe agendas they have, to make sure that this doesn't happen. And I think you will see what you see of Democrats being able to coalesce, get a few Republicans, and stop this. And it's going to certainly undermine, if it comes to that, then Speaker McCarthy's speakership will be in big jeopardy at that point.
Now, as I understand it, the Fed is taking actions to keep things running until about June. Is that where the deadline is looking to be now?
Yeah, I think we've reached that point of the limit around this week, and Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen said there's measures that can be done in the interim up until then, but action will need to be taken. And I kind of wonder, is this with the Senate being a little more stable, and with Mitch McConnell being the grown-up in the room, if you will, that there will be a lot of, he says publicly he's had confidence in McCarthy, but I think there'll be pressure or something within the party to get your act together, get your house, quote unquote, in order, work on it, and enough of this.
Well, let's talk about the political races that are on the horizon. We've already seen a few candidates jump in the ring to be the next governor of Indiana, including Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch of Indiana. How do we see this race playing out? And we'll start with Dr. Dion.
I think it's fair to say that the Republicans start as the favored candidate, so the real fight is which Republican will get the nomination. And I think nationally and here in Indiana, there's been a lot of discussion about where should the Republicans go, how do they want to define themselves. I think Suzanne Crouch is a different style politician than Mike Braun, for example. And so the Republican voters in the primary are going to have to think very carefully about what they want to do. She's a very capable candidate, although she hasn't raised as much money as somebody like Mike Braun, who is self-financing.
Right.
And he's a more aggressive campaigner, I think. We've never had a woman governor in the history of the state of Indiana.
Right.
Kentucky has, Michigan has. So we'll see how that shapes up. Democrats are still looking for a candidate for governor, and the clock is ticking.
Sure.
That's true in other races as well.
Yes, indeed. Well, Professor Henke, what do you think about the gubernatorial race between Suzanne Crouch and Senator Braun? Who do you think has the edge there?
I think Senator Braun has the advantage. Senator Braun has a strong campaigning style. I wonder if perhaps he would have been, if he had run for re-election for Senate, he'd be re-elected anyway. I think he's got a great chance because I think he sees himself as the leader instead of just one of 100. Yeah. And I think the role he had in the Trump administration, the very early part of his Senate, where he was sort of Trump's support voice, if that kind of Trumpism is fading away, that's going to make him less effective of a voice in that fringe of the Republican Party in the Senate. So he might have seen the tea leaves and say, my voice is not going to be as effective as if I run for governor. He's a great retail campaigner, and I think a lot of that approach is going to be effective for him, not just in the fundraising. I think he's going to have an advantage in a lot of ways that Lieutenant Governor Crouch doesn't. Would it be a great moment to have a first female governor? Absolutely, but I see that there's an advantage for Senator Braun to win that nomination.
Well, let's talk about Senator Braun's seat that he is surrendering for this run. I was amazed, I think a lot of folks were, to see this ad bashing the former governor Mitch Daniels from a Washington-based group, essentially saying he's not conservative enough to be the governor of Indiana. He hasn't even announced whether he's going to run or not. What do you see happening in the U.S. Senate race?
I mean, he'll certainly have to compete against those who declared. Jim Banks, the congressman, is going to vie for that seat. You know, it's a natural progression. Mitch Daniels has had a very long career in national politics and was a successful governor. A Senate seat seems like it's in that progression. Having worked for the Reagan administration and George W. Bush administration, he'd be a great senator. We know he was very close of running in 2012 for the Republican nomination for president, which I would suspect he would have actually won that nomination over Mitt Romney, and for family and personal reasons he opted not to. So he's got the name recognition, he's got the clout. I suspect he'll jump in it and certainly have an advantage there in that nomination.
Mr. Dion, do you think he's the candidate to beat?
Banks is a young, ambitious politician from the Northeast, but man, Mitch Daniels is something special in Indiana politics. Very popular. It's interesting though sometimes when somebody like Walter Mondale comes out of mothballs, or Evan Bayh decides to run after some years, they don't do well the second time around. There's a lot of young people who don't remember Mitch Daniels' leadership. Right. But there's no doubt that his resume is remarkable and that he could step in and be a very thoughtful, effective senator for the state if he were to win the primary. But we don't have to go back that far to remember that Evansville's own Dick Murdoch was able to depose Richard Lugar, who was another eminent Hoosier politician. Those primaries can be a really wild event.
Exactly. Often that brings out the base more than it does in the general election. Well, speaking of elections, we have the Evansville mayor's race approaching. We have just a few minutes left here. Some people have declared in, including a couple of prominent Republicans. So far, no Democrats have stepped forward. Dr. Dion, what are your thoughts on the Evansville mayor's race at this point?
Well, just like the empty bronze seat, you have an open seat for mayor because Winnicke's not running, which means by definition it's more competitive, it's up for grabs. I think if Winnicke wanted to run again, I think he'd be favored to win. At its base, this city is fundamentally Democratic. You can see that on the city council majority. It's probably less Democratic than it used to be 10 years ago, but I would still give the Democrats a really, really strong chance of getting back the mayoral seat, but they got to come up with a candidate.
Yeah, I was going to say, if they have a good chance, why haven't they put forth a candidate?
I think that the strategy this time around has been to try to coalesce behind one and not have a divisive, fratricidal primary fight. Let's leave that to the Republicans. That's been the Democratic strategy. And it sure looks like there's going to be a tussle on the Republican side between the forces of one camp and of the other.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that a little bit, Dr. Hanke. On the Republican side right now, you have a candidate endorsed by the Winnicke administration, Rasher, and then the sitting county commission president. So how do you see that race shaping up?
Cheryl Musgrave has been elected countywide 6 times, so she's been formidable as current county commissioner. The situation where you have the Winnicke enclave-backed candidate, some of his inexperience, they've done that and tested that before by backing her opponent in 2016, and she won by 11.5 points. So this strategy has been tried, and it didn't work. And so will it work a second time? It's a difference between a city and county race. It remains to be seen. Natalie Rasher is very charismatic, has got a lot of appeal, but this shows in its totality sort of the tensions between those two factions of the Republican Party. And if they have a formidable Democratic candidate, they're going to have to coalesce, and whatever kind of tensions will have to be put aside. If they run somebody and Cheryl wins, Cheryl may have a hand up when it comes to the general, and they will be on the outside of that. But there's those factions going to have to come together if they want to win, and this community knows that there's tensions between those two.
Right. And there, as we mentioned, when it comes to the primary, it's a different beast than the general, correct? I mean, and this is where you can expect a lot of friction, right?
But you can have certain instances where one candidate, if Cheryl wins, the Winnicke camp may not support her in the general, which will weaken her ability to win. So, Republicans, if they always follow that mantra of falling in line, not falling in love, they need to really coalesce around the candidate who wins the primary.
With just a moment left here, the filing deadline here in Evansville is February 3rd. Do we think there will be a Democratic candidate by then?
I'm convinced there will be.
Any ideas on who it might be?
There are some names in circulation. There are some candidates that I would like to see step forward because I think we're going to select the first woman mayor in the history of the state of Evansville, and that person may be a Democrat or a Republican.
Right, you have two female candidates on the Republican side right now.
That's right.
And
similar, it's hard to speculate the specifics, and I think Dr. Dion's right to kind of avoid sort of the factions that the Democrats and the fratricide, a good word of that. They're keeping it really, really tight, but it is making a lot of the public kind of on edge. Like, who's it going to be? Is sort of like, will we see black smoke or white smoke coming from the Civic Center? Will we know who that candidate will be when they? And of course, obviously, when you file, it's a public thing. So,
sure.
But this will be a very good race, and it's going to be an exciting mayoral race to watch.
Especially
in the primary,
the open seat. I mean, we
especially
don't have
with
an
the
incumbent. We've got a totally wide open race there in the mayor's office. And of course, there will be city council races as well.
Absolutely.
And other offices. Well, I'd like to thank you both for being with us again. That's Dr. Dion from the University of Evansville, Dr. Henke from the University of Southern Indiana. Always good to have your insights. We hope you can come back and visit us again soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. And so once again, next week, our scheduled guest is Indiana Senator Jim Toms. We'll have several questions for the senator. I'm John Gibson of WNIN FM, and we'd like to thank you for watching WNIN Lawmakers.